Hey, this is Sanyam Bhutani, and you're listening to Chai Time Data Science, a podcast for data science enthusiasts where I interview practitioners, researchers, and cagglers about their journey, experience, and talk all things about data science. Hello and welcome to the 75th interview on CTDS.Show, also the 100th interview I ever done. In this episode, I completed the dream of having interviewed my heroes from Fast.ai by interviewing Rachel Thomas on the podcast. Rachel Thomas is the co-founder of Fast.ai and is currently director at the Center for Applied Ethics at the Data Institute at University of San Francisco. This episode is really part 2 of my blog interview with Rachel, so please check that out. This episode covers three broad themes. We talk about top-down learning and what does it take to create a course or material that follows the top-down teaching approach. We discuss the topic that Rachel is currently involved in, ethics and biases. I ask Rachel many questions of how can we do better, how can we address this theme better, something that all of us have been made aware through her efforts, and how can we incentivize someone to contribute to this. We also discuss project building and blogging. Rachel has written two amazing blog posts, which again you can find in the show notes. Please check them out. This episode really addresses a few very important topics, and I try to ask a few important questions that I've been made aware of through Fast.ai. So I hope we all get to learn something about ethics in AI via this episode. For now, here's the conversation. Please enjoy the show. Hi everyone, I am honored to be talking to my guru, our hero, Rachel Thomas. Rachel, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Sanyam. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm honored to be talking to you. Fast.ai is my hero. You both are my heroes. So thanks for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, no, I wish we could be doing this in person, but I'm glad we're online.
Maybe next time. Maybe next year. Okay, so I want to, there'll be a lot of themes that I'll be asking you about definitely, but I want to start by talking about your journey and top-down learning. How did you learn during your university days? Did you follow any top-down approaches? When was the first time you learned something in the quote-unquote top-down fashion?
Yeah, so my university was mostly kind of a traditional bottom-up approach. In hindsight, I didn't recognize this at the time, but two projects that kind of stand out to me. One was in my computer science algorithms course. The professor on the first day gave us these really complicated scheduling problems. And so mine was, and we were doing these in teams, but, students ranking like which classes they wanted to take, and then figuring out like which size room and which time to offer it, and kind of all the conflicts that proposes. And we were told to come up with a solution to optimize the scheduling. And we had like 6 weeks, and it was something that we tried all sorts of things, but you would always kind of come back to like, oh, this seems like to check everything, you would need to be doing something n factorial. Like this isn't possible to optimize 100%. And then kind of the day we turned them in, he was like, let me tell you about NP complete problems. And that was a very memorable experience because I had not heard of NP complete problems and was like, oh, but I feel like that really gave me kind of like a deep understanding of like, oh yeah, like I see kind of how tricky this is by having kind of just wrestled with this one NP complete problem for 6 weeks, searching for a way to optimize it. So that was a fun project, and another memorable one that in hindsight felt like was kind of a a top-down approach was in my, I minored in linguistics, and I took a semester-long class on syntax. And the project for the entire semester was to come up with a set of rules governing the English language.
Okay.
And again, that's something where we kind of started, simple, building them. And then each week, the professor would have counter examples of like, these examples violate your rules. And I think that, both those projects had particularly kind of frustrating moments along the way, but they ended up, I feel like, being very, very memorable and really kind of helping me learn things in a more experiential way.
Which is true to anything that follows a top-down learning approach. You don't realize it after, you only realize after you're done with
yes,
the learning.
Yes.
So speaking about teaching in this fashion, can you give us an insight about behind the scenes at Fast.ai? Now it's an amazing course. Everyone really loves it, but I'm sure there are a lot of challenges with creating a course that follows this approach. And I think you might have defaulted also. You mentioned this to the bottom-up teaching approach. How did you find the balance?
Yes. So it's definitely something where, just because I was in school for, over 20 years, primarily learning bottom up, I definitely default into that. And I know particularly with like the numerical linear algebra class, I had to be very intentional about no, I'm trying to do this in the reverse order and kind of start with these more complex things and then get to the smaller pieces. And so it is something where I think Jeremy and I sometimes kind of have to remind each other of, no, top down would be this way, because it takes more work to do things top down. And I think for many of us, it's kind of not our inclination. But it can be time consuming, and you have to be kind of conscious that that's the goal you're going for.
Makes sense. So you taught many courses, the NLP one, the linear algebra one. Now you're teaching ethics. Which is your favorite if you had to pick one? And do you think it's possible to extend top-down learning approach to other topics of math to make them uncool as well?
So to answer the second part, yes, I think it is. I definitely think it would take me more time to think about, given a particular example, how to do it. I think ethics is currently my favorite, just because that's what I think about most these days, and I think it's so urgent, kind of for all of us to be thinking about ethics.
We'll talk more about that soon, but this is a question from the EMA. What would you change about how math is taught in the US, and what is the best way for someone who's feeling that their math education is inadequate to fulfill their concept needs or the conceptual needs?
So I think for many of us, and it's not the fault of our teachers that this is kind of how math is taught. Math in the US is taught in this very vertical way, where each year really kind of builds on the year before it, which is common in a bottom-up approach.
Yeah.
And a problem with that is if you get one bad math teacher, it's really hard to recover. And so a lot of people I talk to can even kind of pinpoint the year that they lost interest in math, and they had, and sometimes it's not even a teacher, but maybe you have something going on in your life circumstances. And if you have a bad year in math, often you can't recover, because this is kind of another failing of the bottom up approach, is because everything is building, in this very sequential way, you don't have the building blocks you need. So I'd really would want people to get away from that more, and bring in more of kind of the patterns and playfulness of math that can exist. And a few examples, particularly at the high school level. I think a lot of what's taught in discrete math, if you study computer science in college, where you're getting to do, combinations and permutations and kind of some of the counting problems, I think that's really fun. And I think it's a very different flavor of what you see in kind of the algebra calculus sequence. And I wish everybody got to see that, and at a younger age. So I think I would want to incorporate more of that. I also think probability is crucial. I think probability is really important for even just being able to understand the world. And we've seen that with, with issues around like election forecast, when, people saying like, oh, there's an 80% chance this candidate will win. And, people interpreting that as like, oh, they're going to win by 80% or, get 80% of the vote. So I would love to see probability incorporated at a younger age. Also linear algebra, which I love linear algebra. And it kind of makes me sad that many colleges in the US, it's not taught till after calculus. And I think a lot of people kind of get bogged down in the calculus sequence. And so then they never get to see linear algebra, which is just super useful. So in addition to kind of incorporating more top-down approaches, I would also like to see these topics kind of brought in earlier. And I think they could help with some of that feeling like even if you don't understand one of the topics at the time, you can still learn and do well with the next topic.
I think one of the really cool ways, I think it was either you or Jeremy who had shown, maybe while implementing attentional layers, that here's how it looks in mathy terms versus here's how it looks in code. That can also be a big motivator.
Yes.
Maybe I'm coming from the hacker community, so I'm biased.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, like writing it out in code really is a great way to test if you understand it, and often feels easier or simpler than the math approach or equation approach.
Definitely. So jumping forward to someone who's created a good project, someone from Fast.ai communities who has shared their uncool story of building a project, our work gets highlighted a lot thanks to you. We have this small Fast.ai Twitter community that is very helpful towards each other in highlighting our work. But how can we make a wider machine learning community, the wider research community that might not be able to appreciate a farmer's work who has never coded but has been able to implement an application as much as they should?
So I think we're seeing that change some. Like I definitely think things have improved a lot from say compared to like 2012, 2013. I think the field has opened up, and I think even kind of the major companies have shown more interest in kind of offbeat projects. And so there's still more work to be done, but I think that there have been some positive changes, and I hope Fast.ai has been kind of a part of that of trying to change and broaden the focus.
I'm biased, but I'll say it definitely has been.
Oh, thank you.
So, if you were to pick an underrated side of Fast.ai that you wish gets more coverage, what would that be?
And you're going to be very familiar with this, but I think in the broader AI community, I think there's often a perception that Fast.ai is just for beginners, of like, oh, this is just a way for beginners to get started. And so I wish that more people knew that like the Fast.ai library is state of the art, and the Fast.ai course takes you to the state of the art, and it's not just for beginners, and it can be used in research and in production. So that's kind of I feel like key misconception. And then related to that, also getting out the word about the Fast.ai software library, because I think we're best known for the course, and some people kind of think that that's all there is.
I'm a bad student because I've never really completed part 2 of the course, but it's so rich that I've always been a student, and I think I'll stay a student for a few more years.
Oh, that's great.
Now, switching to another topic that you're currently involved in, ethics and broadly speaking biases, you decided to start Fast.ai after realizing that deep learning was exclusive. You shared a few stories. How far would you say that Fast.ai has reached in solving that mission?
Yeah, I think we've definitely made progress, and I think we have given kind of an on ramp to many people that might not previously have had one. Although there's certainly a lot more work to do, and I think there also still really remains kind of the issues around just cultural perception, and a lot of people, it just never occurs to them that deep learning could be something they could be involved with, or that they could have something to contribute to. And I think this also relates to a lot of the cultural perceptions around math or computer science, and people thinking that it's not for them, or that they don't have the right background to be a part of it. And then we also kind of have all the biases within the industry that can make it harder for people with non-traditional backgrounds to get hired.
Yeah.
And that's something that kind of even when you've given the on-ramp, and I think we have students from Fast.ai that are incredibly qualified and experts, that kind of getting others to recognize that in hiring can still sometimes be an obstacle.
Yes, to convince someone that you have 15 years of experience in AI, you just need to be like Geoff Hinton himself.
Yeah.
Was there a specific point that led you to switching to working in a full-time capacity for applied ethics, or any incident or any story that led you
It
to the
was
decision?
no, it was kind of a gradual transition. I found myself just spending more and more time thinking about ethics and writing about it and giving talks about it. And so I sometimes refer to it as kind of my side hobby that took over my life. But it was never until I got offered the position with USF. Although at that point I was already devoting so much time to ethics that it was like, oh, this totally makes sense and is really natural. But it was kind of this topic I couldn't stop thinking about.
You've highlighted so many biases that you had unfortunately faced in industry or otherwise. Why is it important that we start looking at them right now, especially in AI, where most of the apps aren't even ready for the real world?
Oh, yes, because I mean, so we have seen from stuff that's been deployed all these really, really alarming repercussions. And I think, in the United States, I think there's a lot of really great conversation happening now, particularly around racism and white supremacy. And we're seeing, and this is something that people have been warning about for years of, how facial recognition can be used to surveil protesters. This is not a new issue. And something I try to mention when I teach is, there was a Black man, Freddie Gray, who was killed in Baltimore a few years ago. And during the protest after his murder, police used facial recognition to identify protesters, which I think is incredibly alarming. And I think that those sorts of concerns are really heightened now. And that's kind of just one example, but this technology has very profound real world impact that also is incredibly intertwined with bias and race and power and kind of how these technologies are used.
Makes sense. So, Rachel, you made all of us, at least Fast.ai students, aware about the biases and the ethical responsibility that we should hold. But how can we make a person go the extra mile? Sure, you're aware of it. You know the biases that exist, but how do you take the extra step to make sure that it doesn't happen under your watch?
Yeah, so there's I mean, so I don't know that you can't make somebody who is perhaps resistant. I think there are many people out there that want to do the right thing and really care about the world and wanting to do good. And so in many cases, I think giving people knowledge or giving people concrete tools they can use. And for this, I really like the Markula Center has a tech ethics toolkit of kind of practices you can implement in your company. One of those is doing like ethical risk sweeps, and so kind of taking this idea from cybersecurity of really trying to proactively look for ethical risk and to build that into your process. So there are definitely practices you can implement, and I think there are many people that are inspired and motivated when they hear stories of others kind of standing up for what's ethical and what's right. But on a broader level, I do think this is why we need structural changes and policy changes as well, because individual motivation is not going to get us all the way there. And so it's really tough because I think there's this total misalignment of incentives right now in tech, and particularly in venture capital, and in the emphasis also on metrics and kind of having these metrics around advertising revenue and click-through rates can often incentivize really kind of negative consequences for society. And I think for many companies, even if there are people there that want to do the right thing, it can be hard if you're always fighting your business model.
You
And
mentioned
that's kind of where the need for like policy and structural changes is.
Definitely. You mentioned structural changes. There's a lot of finger pointing that happens in the industry. Top level management would point
Yeah.
to the engineers, so on and so forth. Who should really be conscious and who should be held responsible, or
Yeah,
who should take hold of the responsibility, if I may put it like that?
this is tough, and Dana Boyd talks about this of that even prior to computers, bureaucracy has often been used for people to evade responsibility. And in an extreme example, we saw this in Nazi Germany of kind of a lot of officials just saw them as bureaucrats and were able to kind of point to others on responsibility. And unfortunately, today's algorithmic systems are kind of just extending that bureaucracy and making it. And so, there have been cases of their algorithms that can be used to screen tenants, a landlord could use. And so, and I've seen cases where, like a Black man was denied being able to rent this apartment, even though he had a very stable job. And the landlord was like, oh, it's not my decision. This is what the algorithm told me. And so we're getting a lot of that in different areas. And then within companies, you get that as well of so many companies are just, these really complex systems in different siloed areas. And so it's a tough problem. It's not what humans are good at. You definitely need senior leadership taking responsibility and making ethics a priority. But I think the first step is kind of recognizing that, even recognizing that we're kind of creating these systems where nobody feels responsible.
Yeah, the other part of the problem is, how do we create a open culture? I work at a startup where this is a problem, so I'm the wrong person to ask this question. But how do we come up with a culture where no one is afraid to speak up when they see a problem?
Yeah, so that needs to be modeled, because it is true that in many startups, it's or not just startups, many companies in general, it's not safe to speak up, and so I think many people that are worried about that, their fear may very well be justified. So I do think you need to kind of see the example coming from leaders speaking up. And also even incentivizing. I've heard of kind of proposals of, giving a reward to an engineer that raises an ethical concern, but kind of building that into incentives. And it's really tough, because there's often this focus on doing everything as fast as possible in tech, but to take the time to stop and reflect on what potential ethical issues are, or take the time to investigate a potential ethical issue, in a culture that prizes speed above all else, that's not going to be, that's going to be seen as a negative. And so you do have to kind of address that.
Again, the structural part of it comes into picture again.
Yes. Yeah, it always kind of comes back to the structural part.
Yeah, there's another issue that you've raised, and it does exist, the gender imbalance in teams or otherwise. I'm ashamed of this as well. My podcast has a 10% women representation in the heroes that I've interviewed, but so that's a problem that I'm contributing to. But how do you think we can improve or solve it?
Yeah, so it takes effort. So yeah, definitely kind of, it's good to recognize the problem, and then to realize that you need to put effort into it. And this needs to be kind of an ongoing process too. I think a lot of companies kind of wait too late, until they already kind of have a big team. Even when you're at the point of when you're ready to hire, in a sense, is almost too late. Like ideally, you would start before you're even hiring anyone. In a company context, kind of the number one advice I want to give is to treat the women and people of color, particularly Black and Latinx and Indigenous employees, really well now. So really to focus on the employees you already have, and if you treat them well and give them opportunities to advance, but to kind of think about, like, what can you do to make your environment appealing so that people will want to work there, is a key. Another key, and this, this is tough. In the United States, there's studies that I can't remember, the average white person, I think, has, it's either 0 or 1 Black friends. I think it's maybe zero Black friends, that we just are kind of very segregated, and particularly white people are able to kind of not have close relationships with people of color unless they're being very intentional about it. And since so much hiring that happens in startups and tech companies is through friends and is through your social networks, I think to always be working on trying to diversify your social network, and doing that in a meaningful and genuine way of really just trying to build friendships for the long haul. But I think it's understandable that people want to hire their friends and hire people they trust. But there's kind of a lot of inertia working against us. And so you kind of need to be working on diversifying your social network.
I think there are also two sides to the problem. Like, I don't think this is a good approach, but many people, what they do is we need a woman on the panel, so let us go out and invite one. The other one is,
Yeah.
hey, maybe I'm biased towards my community. Should I look outside of it? There are talented people outside of our communities as well.
Yes, yeah, no, there's true. Yeah, there's definitely talent outside our communities, and so ways to, and this is something that I think we need to do more at Fast.ai too. Is kind of how can we be diversifying our community further. Yeah, and to have the connections and the invites be meaningful as well. Yeah, I have been invited for panels where I'm like, I'm not even really related to that topic. It makes me feel like they're just asking me because I'm a woman. Or
Yeah. So again, speaking of community, there's a question from the community. What advice would you have for a woman trying to navigate deep learning field as a newbie? They sometimes feel afraid to ask a question or clarification because it sounds stupid or basic.
yeah, so this is a tough one. I wanted to just acknowledge that tension. That one, asking questions is super important, but that also it is true that sometimes people will judge you, particularly if you're from an underrepresented group, when you ask questions. And I feel like we see this on Twitter every so often. There'll be a movement of software engineers, and perhaps predominantly white or male software engineers, saying how they have to Google basic things. And then, a Black woman software engineer will point out, like, I couldn't publicly admit to this because people would really judge me. And so that there is, people are perceived differently when they ask questions. And so I actually don't have a great answer to this question, but just wanted to acknowledge the tension that I definitely hope you're getting your questions answered, and that you find kind of safe communities to ask them in, but recognizing that, sometimes in the workplace, maybe there would be negative repercussions in certain groups.
If I may chime in, as unqualified as I am to answer that question, but we recently completed the fourth run of the course, and I posted a lot of questions. I would really feel shy to ask the questions. I'd feel all of those were stupid, but they got a lot of likes. The approach that we follow on the forum. So I think
Oh, great! Yeah.
there's also one hesitation to just asking questions.
Oh yes, no,
Fast.ai
I think
community is very welcoming.
everybody feels it. Yes, I think everybody can feel scared about asking questions, and and I think anything you can do also, as somebody listening to questions, to kind of affirm that there's no stupid question, that any question is a good one, to go out of your way to help others, or ways that we can all kind of encourage a culture of asking questions. But you're absolutely right that I think everybody sometimes, maybe even often, worries about the questions they ask.
And like you said, just mentioning the small word, this is a great question, or just liking their question also is a great incentive to the person as well
Yes,
asking the question.
yes, yeah.
So you're teaching us all about ethics. We're pretty aware of it, but how do we get someone from the outside world, some researcher who's, let's say, just focus on improving a model or improving their personal skills? How do we convince them to also divert some of their time towards these important issues?
Yeah, again, that's tough. I think there are people that are convinced when they see the societal implications and that learning more can help them. Um, uh, but again, there are also structural issues, and I think that sometimes it comes back to many of these ethics issues end up being very interdisciplinary, and it's very, very important that we be drawing from kind of the social sciences and the humanities and how we approach them. And I'm most familiar with the US, but there's often been this kind of exalting STEM over other fields, and in the tech industry, kind of exalting coding and math skills over other types of skills and other types of expertise. And so some of what needs to happen, I think, is being able to recognize and value other areas and other skills more, for someone with a very technical background to recognize the importance of humanities and social science expertise, and the kind of need for that in exploring ethical issues and addressing them.
Yeah. I think one of the ways you mentioned is just incentivizing. Some institute incentivize when someone brings up a topic, but second part would just being aware of the problem.
Yes, yeah, and you're right. I know that's a great one too about incentivizing, and I did have a student who had worked at a healthcare tech company who said that, they had a process in place where you could raise a potential ethical issue, and then they had a specific team that would investigate it for you, and that they really liked that process of kind of feeling like somebody would look into this. And the student that told me this had raised ethical issues twice, and he said once it turns out it was not actually an issue, but there's no negative repercussion at all about raising something that turns out to not be an issue, because I think the company was glad to just be investigating and to try to catch things earlier.
Okay. Now I want to switch gears towards another topic that you educated us on, blogging and projects.
Yes.
Thank you for inspiring all of us. Most of us wouldn't have even started blogging without your advice. Most people start with projects and blog posts that are low-hanging fruits. How do we start seeking more difficult problems? Because again, that's where people get uncomfortable.
One thing, I think it's okay to move incrementally and to start with a simple project and then think about ways to expand it or make it more complicated. I think also and this I guess kind of goes back to one of your earlier questions. I love it when people write blog posts about things that didn't work and what they got errors on, because I think there's so much that we learn from that, of just hearing for somebody else of, what didn't work for them in a project. But I think people are often more reluctant to share that sort of information. And so kind of whatever we can do as a community to encourage kind of also people sharing not just the success stories, but kind of the failures of, this is where I totally got stuck, or, this is an approach that I thought would work and I tried it and it didn't. But I do think we learn a lot as a community from those.
It's a superficial metric, but my most viewed article is one where I had shared that I failed the Google AI residency interview.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, thank you for your openness in sharing that too. I think that takes bravery to share, but I think it really resonates with people. It's something that everybody can relate to, kind of experiences like that.
Yeah. So coming to what would be your best advice for finding a project to contribute to while going through Fast.ai? Something that maybe can become an incremental problem.
Yeah. There's so many things that would be good projects. Really, so definitely if there's something that you're already interested in or a data set you already have, that can be great. But even if there isn't, I feel like I often talk to students that are kind of trying to find the perfect project or trying to find a project that nobody has ever done before. And I would want to encourage people that, even if you're using a data set that other people have used, or a project where other people have done something similar, that you can still learn a ton by doing that, and that you're still going to have your own unique spin on it, and you can still kind of take it in a different direction. The more you can kind of align it with a background interest of yours, I think that can be helpful, but it's okay if you don't feel like you have a passion aside from deep learning to kind of be applying it to.
There are also a lot of advices that you both mentioned while running the course that also become interesting projects, interesting endpoints.
Yes, yeah.
So this is the final question. You and Jeremy both have given us so much. How can we contribute back to the mission? What can we do better? What should we be doing to help the mission?
Yeah, and I want to say, you've done a ton as well, Sanyam. I love your blog post and the podcast. It's great, kind of everything you do for the community.
Thank you.
I would just say, anything. So definitely answering the questions of others, and so kind of answering questions in the forums, helping others. Anything you can kind of writing a thorough walkthrough of how you did something. I think kind of, just teaching and helping others is a way to help the community, and also promoting, caring and compassionate behavior. And like you were saying before, kind of even the simple act of liking somebody's question or saying that's a great question can be really, really affirming and helpful.
If I can reframe that, even me personally, I've been treated as a future good deep learning practitioner by Rachel Thomas and Jeremy Howard, and that's the best feeling on the community. And I think at least on the Fast.ai community, that's a feeling that everyone tries to foster.
Yes, fostering that feeling of that, everyone has so much potential, and an encouragement about when things don't work out. and this is maybe a little bit related, but a story I like to tell from college is the first time I tried to take real analysis, which is kind of a core area of math and was required for the math major. Some of this was, I think, the teacher, but I got into the class and I was miserable and I had no idea what was happening. And I can't remember, it was only like the first or second week of school. I like came home from the library at like 3 a.m. crying. And I was just like, this class is terrible. And my roommates were like, you need to drop this. And I was really concerned because I was just like, oh, you need this to be a math major. And when I went to my advisor, who was a math professor, she was like, she's like, Rachel, this wasn't your year. She's like, you're going to take this course again next year. You'll do great. You can do this. It's just like, isn't the right time for you. And it was really encouraging to me, how she kind of framed that as, it's not a failure that you're dropping this class and that you're going to do it again later. And it ended up, I took it again the next year and got an A and ended up focusing on that even in my PhD and my quals. It was an area I ended up loving. And so kind of reminding people that even if you do have a really bad or discouraging experience, that's not, a statement on what you're capable of in the future. And maybe, this just isn't the right time, but that you can return to kind of any topic again at a different point, and maybe you will love it then. So I think kind of to be able to reframe kind of failure or when things don't work is helpful as well.
I was hoping you would have scored an A+. Rachel, thank you so much for all of your contributions to the community, and thank you so much for all you've done for the Fast.ai community. Before we end the call, I know your Twitter is math_Rachel, and there's the website Fast.ai. Any other platform that you'd like to mention?
No, those are, and then also the course, course.fast.ai, of course, in the forums.fast.ai is a way to kind of connect with others. But yeah, those are the kind of the main platforms I'm on.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Sanyam. No, this was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to give it a review or feel free to shoot me a message. You can find all of the social media links in the description. If you like the show, please subscribe and tune in each week to Chai Time Data Science.